It's okay to not enjoy reading biblical genealogies. They're not in the Bible because they're fun to read. In fact, the only people who ever had any fun in genealogies were those doing the begetting. Seriously, there are three kinds of biblical genealogies. First, Israel's land and property allotments in Canaan were recorded in their family and tribal genealogical records. Every 50 years, during the celebration of Jubilee, property reverted to original owners, so they needed historic property records so that the right families got their land back. Second, tabernacle duties were assigned to 3 Levite families, and the priesthood belonged to Aaron's descendants, so you needed to be able to prove your lineage to qualify. When the people of Judah returned from Babylon, this kicked in because there were people claiming they were priests who were not found in the lineage and excluded. Third, and of the greatest concern to all people, were the genealogies that identified the lineage that would lead to the Messiah. Genesis 5 through 9 is the first compiled section of the Messianic genealogy, and it shows us the normal format, with occasional expansions. The patriarch is named, with years lived until a prominent son is born, then years lived after the prominent son's birth. Other sons and daughters are mentioned, the patriarch's total lifespan, and then each entry ends with, "and he died." Noah's record begins at 532, contains required information, expanded information about the decline of civilization and the flood account, and then ends at 9:28 and 29 with, "and he died." Genesis 5 records the Messiah's lineage from Adam to Noah. You will notice the very long lives before the flood, which are also mentioned in ancient Mesopotamian legends. Note also in 5:1 and 2 that humans were man when they first appeared, not millions of years of gradual transformation from chimps, and that's probably why the fossil record does not look like that happened. Also note that physical lineage does not guarantee spirituality, for few spiritual men show up in this lineage. The exceptions are found in Seth's son Enosh, when men began to call on the name of the Lord. Enoch walked with God and did not die, and Noah also was a righteous man who walked with God. The lesson? Our genealogical lineage is physically determined by others, but our personal spirituality, seeking and believing God, is our choice and responsibility. In Genesis 6, 1 through 13, we encounter major features of the pre-flood world. Verses 1 and 2, the sons of God were attracted to the daughters of men, and through them produced the mighty men of old, men of renown. In verse 3, God determined to either shorten human lifespans or bring the flood in 120 years. In verse 4, the Nephilim, or giant life forms, were on the earth in those days. In verses 5 through 7, 11 and 12, it describes the decline of civilization into corruption and violence. In verses 8 and 10, God selected Noah, a righteous man, as his agent to preserve life through a coming great flood judgment. In verses 1, 2, and 4, the sons of God were attracted to the daughters of men, took them as wives, and produced through them pre-flood mighty men of renown, capable of great earthly accomplishments. Who were they? Well, down to the time of Jesus, a popular notion was that this involved rebellious angels cohabiting with human women, producing demigods, paralleled in the Greek mythology of the Titans. However, as a different class of beings, could angels have even fertilized human women? Jesus said angels do not marry, and Peter said the angels that sinned were locked away. On the other hand, were these the godly sons of Seth, foolishly intermarrying with the worldly women of Cain's line? Remember, the text says they produced men, not demigods. Genesis 6:3 indicates that God determined that his spirit will not strive or judge with man eternally because he is flesh, so his days will be 120 years. Well, since men lived well beyond 120 years for some time after the flood, it is more likely that God is referring to the time before he will bring judgment through the flood. We know the flood began in the 600th year of Noah's life, when his son Shem was 98 years old. So God could have made this determination 120 years before the flood, giving time for Noah to have sons who could grow up enough to help with the project. In Genesis 6:4, the word Nephilim means fallen ones, but the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament books made before Jesus' time, translated the word into Greek as gigantes. Numbers 13:33 associates the term Nephilim with a group of larger post-flood people in Canaan, the Anakim and others, probably the people from which Goliath's family came from. Thus, large size, rather than fallen angels, is probably the intention. The text says the Nephilim were on the earth at the same time as when the sons of God and daughters of men were producing children who became mighty men of renown. So it is possible that the mighty men were also larger, with remnants of that still in the later Middle East. Fossils indicate that pre-flood life was often much larger than what is seen now. Crocodiles 40 feet long, sharks similar to great whites 75 feet long, birds like eagles with 25-foot wingspans, and more. In verses 5, 11, and 12, over time, early human civilization chose to follow the way of Cain, noted in Jude 11. We met Cain back in Genesis 4, where we saw his self-centered anger and evil. He departed from God's presence. His descendants embraced macho and revenge, and it appears humanity followed that worldview. Individuals and civilizations come to be characterized by the values they choose to exalt, which led pre-flood humanity into increasing deterioration, corruption, and violence. Exodus 23:2 warned against following the crowd into evil, and 2 Timothy 3:13 says that evil men and impostors will tend to get worse over time. While God grieved over rebellious humanity and finally determined to clean house with the flood, he foreknew this would happen. Isaiah 46:10 says that God knows the end from the beginning. However, evil is a reality because God chose to allow his image creatures a measure of free will. So we have to play out our choices, just as Judas did. Other scriptures will show us God's emotion over sin, rebellion, and death before judgment eventually falls on rebels. Pre-flood humanity chose to follow the way of Cain, embracing evil and corruption. But don't forget the exceptions: Abel, Enosh, Enoch, etc. All have sinned, but for some it's the occasional weakness or missing the mark, while for others it is an ongoing downward lifestyle of crime, corruption, and depravity. The two paths, identified by Moses in Deuteronomy 30:15-20, and Jesus in Matthew 7:13 and 14, have always been real options since Eden, and God has always urged those with ears to hear to choose the path that leads to life. We make real choices in this life, and they matter eternally. Genesis 6:8 through 9:29 is Noah's genealogical record expanded with the flood story. In verses 8 through 10, like Abel and Enoch, Noah was a good man who chose not to follow the evil trend of surrounding human culture, but took the narrow way. It says he was a righteous man, blameless in his time, who walked with God. And he had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Verses 11 and 12 tells us that on the other hand, humanity had become corrupt or corrupted themselves. Contrary to a popular notion, depravity is not passed on to all genetically, but develops in those who continue to choose rebellion, evil, and gradually corrupt themselves. We are told that Israel corrupted themselves with idolatry at Sinai and later in Exodus 32:7 and Hosea 5:2 and 9:9. In Romans 1:21-32, Paul described in detail how Israel corrupted themselves by rejecting God and choosing to pursue increasingly depraved thoughts and actions. In chapter 6, verses 13-22, Noah was chosen by God to preserve life in a great ark, a stable barge of wood, for which God provided the blueprints. The ark was to be 300 by 50 by 30 cubits. A cubit was about 18 inches, which made the ark 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. It carried representative major kinds of life through a year-long flood of water. For as in Genesis 1, basic kinds can produce great variety over time. The fossil record shows great extermination events, with some forms never reappearing. Genesis 7:1-10 tells us Noah and his family were sealed in the ark for 7 days before the rain began to fall. Thus, there were no last-minute warning signs for slackers to observe and then make a last-minute dash for the ark and escape. In 7:11-8:22, we have a description of 40 days of torrential rain plus underground water bursting forth, the floodgates of the sky, and the fountains of the deep. 7:24 describes gradually rising waters plus tidal action for 150 days, and all of this water washing over and eventually covering the continents would produce a lot of stratified deposits containing a lot of buried victims. Chapter 8:1-3 tells us that then there was 150 days of receding water, again with daily tidal action. The ark grounded on Mount Ararat, but water continued receding and draining into the ocean beds. This was a major catastrophe, lasting a year and 10 days. Survivors would have passed on the story, which explains why the major features of Genesis 1-11, supernatural creation, long lives, and then a great flood judgment, were a shared memory that spread outward into many cultures after the division of languages and people groups at Babel. Well, Genesis 8:15-22 describes leaving the ark, Noah's altar, and God's promise. In verses 15-19, God tells Noah and all in it to leave the ark. In verse 20, Noah built an altar and offered a thanksgiving sacrifice. In verses 21 and 22, God was pleased with the offering and made a promise to never again curse the ground or end all life with another worldwide flood. Now, he was not lifting the curse on the ground or death in Eden, for Romans 8:19-25 says that the curse of decline on creation is still in force, as is physical death. God promised that he would not curse the ground because the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth and destroy every living thing, as I have done. This is not a proof text for universal original sin and total depravity, for God is referring back to why he brought the flood, because humanity had gradually corrupted themselves to the point that, as Genesis 6:5 says, every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Well, this does not describe the heart of Noah, the other exceptions already noted, or even most of my neighbors. But it does describe how bad things were before the flood. Rather than another flood of water, seasons and day and night will continue while the earth remains. In Genesis 9, 1 through 7, God gave Noah's family some post-flood instructions. In verses 1 and 7, they were to spread out and repopulate the earth. However, as we soon will see, the post-flood crew later decided to rebel on this one and stay together in Mesopotamia. In verses 2 through 4, animal flesh was added to the menu, but they were not to eat blood as a food item, for it would later be associated with atonement. In verses 5 and 6, taking an innocent human life, homicide, would cost you your own life, and this was applied to both people and animals. Capital punishment was not expected to be a dependable deterrent to all murderers, but it was intended as a penalty response to underscore the value of the innocent life of a divine image creature that was taken. Of course, capital punishment is 100% effective in deterring repeat offenses, which make up a large portion of reported crimes. In 9, 8 through 17, God promised to not again destroy the whole earth with a flood of water. The rainbow is a naturally occurring event, but God designated it as a reminder of this judgment and promise. In verse 11, God did not promise no more water floods, just not another worldwide flood. Peter will later tell us that later judgment and destruction will be by fire. In 9, 18, and 19, it is plainly said that all post-flood humanity came from Noah's 3 sons and their wives. Everybody now living on planet Earth is a descendant of Noah through one of his 3 sons. Chapter 10 will summarize the various early nations and language groups that resulted from the division at Babel. In Genesis 9, 20 to 23, we are told that after the flood, Noah did some farming and some drinking. He became a bit schnockered, and he lay uncovered in his tent. Now, he's not parading around out and about in the nude, he's just in his tent. The first lesson is that drunkenness does tend to produce some embarrassing results. While Ham saw his dad in this condition and told his brothers, it was a big joke, and it appears that Ham's son Canaan was involved in some way. Maybe he saw Grandpa first and told his dad. But Shem and Japheth respectfully backed into the tent with a garment and covered Noah without looking at him. There's a lesson here. There are 2 possible responses to the embarrassing sins of others. You can go out and tell others so as to ridicule them. It's called gossip, and that's what Canaan and Ham did. Or you can help the embarrassed person to put it behind them and move on. That's what Shem and Japheth did. In Genesis 9, 24 to 27, we have Noah's patriarchal curses and blessings. A curse was placed on Canaan. Now some, especially in the American South, have wrongly taken this as a curse on Ham and Africans, but the curse was not on Ham. It was on Canaan and the Canaanites. It is probably a prediction of Canaanite servitude to Israel later on. Shem is identified as central, and the messianic lineage will proceed through Shem's line. You can see Genesis 11, 10 through 27. Japheth will share in Shem's blessings and be enlarged, probably meaning they will prosper and be influential over a large area. In verses 28 and 29, and he died, ends Noah's genealogical record.